Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I just want to let you all know we had a slight change of plans. Last week I announced that this week Dot Nielsen would be on our guest with Ken Atkins. They had to postpone. They will be on in 2 weeks. So we did a little switching, and tonight Art Costa is here with me, and we're going to talk about some events that are coming up later in the month. And that was actually what we had planned for the 21st. So we really just switched. You'll get everything we planned sooner or later. I just want to announce quickly the new Riverside Community Garden to be is going to have a table at Fiddleheads this Saturday, so stop by and see us. It will be from 10 to 2. Same time as a farmer's market. So welcome, Art.
Mm-hmm.
Art, most of you know Art, but he's the founder and president of Thames Valley Sustainable Connections, and it's an organization that has been working since 2007 or 8 on, among other things, improving the local economic climate. So welcome, Art.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is, you know, we all think about these conventional ways of stimulating our economy, tax incentives, and we brought Pfizer, and then we brought EB to New London, and none of them has totally been a game changer. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what the conventional wisdom is and why it might not be so wise.
Yeah, well, I think you just described it. That's looking for the silver bullet. Usually it's a giant organization that's going to come in and it's going to bring all these jobs, and it's going to make everything different and better, and it's going to transform the area economically. And what we find is it doesn't usually happen that way, and it's not unique to New London. I know we've all know our experiences here, but this happens throughout the country, really throughout the world, but definitely throughout the country. Large corporate entities are wooed with tax incentives to come into an area, and usually with the idea of creating a lot of jobs. And those jobs, when you finally figure out and run the numbers, are hundreds of thousands of dollars per job. And frequently, once certain tax incentives start to fade and disappear, the organization decides that they see some greener pastures elsewhere where they can get some more of that great incentive, and so they pick up roots. They don't really have strong roots to the community, and so they move on. And this gets repeated over and over again, almost as if we never quite get it. Maybe there's a time lag between cause and effect, and it seems to kind of create this iterative kind of process where we go back out after it again. Okay, that one didn't work, let's get another one. And that cycle is played just over and over again. There's been some great studies done on this that indicate that it's very rare that one of those silver bullets actually takes root and becomes an important entity long term, or they can become such an important entity that that they dominate the whole economic environment. And so there's really, it's like a one-town company.
And actually, that's got its dangers, too. I read recently that, you know, Kodak closing in Rochester, New York, has had a devastating effect.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's for sure. We see this, you know, time and again where, you know, large entities, I'll call them corporate entities, because that's what they tend to be. Nothing against corporations. They come in different sizes, but what we know is that about for every 2 out of 3 jobs are created in this country are created by small independent businesses, locally rooted, if you will, and yet our investment in these businesses are almost nil. if 50% or better of the jobs that are created come from these small businesses, then why isn't the investment in the small business, and that includes federal investments as well as state investments and local investment, and our investment, our personal, where our pensions go and so forth, seem to escape the local economy and go elsewhere, and so our wealth is dispersed throughout the universe.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that concept of leakage, what that refers to.
Yeah, that's an important and yet simple idea. What we find here, even in New London, is that there's a tremendous amount of wealth and assets that exist here. But for some reason, particularly in terms of the financial side of it, so much of that money just disappears out of the area. And so we've seen in a portion of New London where the expenditures, according to the census of 2010, are like $62 million in expenditures per year in a section of New London that is considered relatively poor. So why? If you have $62 million that come through an area, should it remain socioeconomically poor? And much of that has to do with the fact that almost none of that money is spent locally. And when it does get spent locally, it usually goes to a corporate headquarters that's well out of Connecticut. And so that money is lost to the area, and most of it is lost. It creates some jobs, but of each dollar spent, maybe 30 cents, 35 cents stays local, and the rest just disappears. So understanding that idea that this kind of our own wealth is not captured and circulated long enough to generate jobs and do some really good things here, we just fall into that trap of watching it all just go out the door.
So what's the alternative? And we can be brief now because we do have a video after a little while that we want to show that shows how other people are thinking about this idea. But just, to summarize, what can we do about that?
Okay, well, and this video will talk a bit more about investment and how local investment can happen, which will lead us into our event at the end of the month. But basically, what we need first to do is understand what are our assets, what is the wealth that passes through New London, millions and millions of dollars, I would say billions. We have over $1 billion just in pensions that are kind of locked up and away from the local economy. So by understanding that what creates this leakage is because much of what we purchase is not made locally, much of it is connected to outside organizations where the money goes. And that's where the leakage happens, and by considering things like import substitution, where rather than importing everything, you begin to look at opportunities for what could be made locally and become the source of what people buy. And it's not that we're going to make everything here in the New London area or even in Connecticut, but if we begin to nurture those kinds of things, we can start to put some stoppers on that leakage that happens. And so that's one thing. And of course, just thinking and acting locally, it can make a big difference.
Buying from a real local merchant when possible. Right.
If the value is there, think local first. And if you can't find it, well, then of course you go where you need to go. But if you just stop and think about, gee, where could I get this locally? And we're finding over the last, since you mentioned 2007, during that time, we've seen a shift in the way people think and behave in terms of their purchases. Even before that, there's always been a certain sense of the relationship people have with where they buy things, as opposed to, going into a place where nobody knows anybody and you're just simply going for a specific price, and there's no other experience had with that. So there's a shift. We're seeing it with more and more local purchasing. More city purchasing has got to happen as well, where we start to look at where can the city purchase locally and wherever possible. So those are some of the quick things, and then we can.
Okay, well, there are a couple events coming up in the end of May, and Michael Schumann is going to be in New London. Maybe you can tell a little bit now about what his work is, and then after the video we'll talk in more detail.
Yeah, Michael Schumann is an individual who we've tried to get here in New London for about 5 years.
Probably since about 2007, right?
About 2007. For those who may remember, I ran for city council in 2007, and I picked up a handy-dandy book called Going Local, and it was written by this fellow named Michael Schumann. And I found it just very engrossing, and it just resonated with me in terms of what could happen here in New London. And it just so happens that in Great Barrington in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, Michael was speaking at a conference, and I went there, and after he finished speaking, I introduced myself, and we started talking. And we've been talking on and off ever since. New London Local First, which is one of the projects of Thames Valley Sustainable Connections, is also a member of an organization called BALI, Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And Mr. Schumann is very much, he's a policy advisor for that organization and works for a number of others as well. But he's a man of immense depth and breadth of knowledge and experience as an entrepreneur, a writer, regarding local economies and what are the opportunities that we can have in terms of investing locally, and why that hasn't happened sooner. What's the history of that? Actually, at one time, there were stock markets all over the country. There was no Wall Street per se. They were located in states throughout the country, so people could invest locally. So the reason why we invest locally and why all the capital disappears in part is because it's easy to. Everything's been set up to do that, and there's really no simple mechanism that anybody has to invest locally. So that's the kind of thing he'll address, and there's been a lot of changes over the last several years, and that have changed the dynamics on that.
Okay, we have a call, and then after that, I hope we'll be able to have the video. Hi, thanks for calling Thinking Green.
Hey, Rona, Art, this is Dennis from New London. I'll make it short because I know you want to show your film. I think as far as downtown goes, you talk about people buying local, and I assume you're meaning more downtown than anywhere else, and correct me if I'm wrong. But don't you think that if we got more, if we went to the people that live outside of the city itself and found out things that they normally buy and then try to get stores down there that would sell these kind of products to get more people to come downtown, might be a direction we could try to go in?
Well, that's certainly a market here, and of course when we talk about the area, we don't really put a specific line around a municipality. Our surrounding areas are part of our region, and they are, as you mentioned, Dennis, they're very important to the health and well-being of New London, and we're very important to their overall health and well-being too. New London Local First, just to kind of get back to your first note there, is across New London. So
yeah, it's not just restricted to downtown.
Right, it's not restricted to just downtown. We certainly have a lot of members downtown because that is our commercial district, but we have members on the waterfront, Broken Yoke or the Yoke, and all the way down to Mr. G's and Copycats and so forth, and then of course all of those places that are in between there. And we do connect to organizations outside of New London as well. So we see ourselves as kind of a regional, with New London as a core urban center. And to your point, I do think having people come here with some frequency, we know the Guard is a major attractor for bringing people in from all over the area, and the Hygienic is as well.
Sure.
So there's certainly that, and we have, I'll quickly mention this, New London Local First has a directory. It's probably the only promotional material that is going to encompass New London that gets distributed throughout southeastern Connecticut. So we do definitely talk up what New London's all about, and it's pretty interesting when you take a look at that.
But I think it is a good point to be looking at the kinds of things that people want, although, and you look at like the Fiddleheads Food Co-op has been growing, and more people shop there who don't live strictly within walking distance, but they're
Right.
coming in from surrounding suburbs as well as the city. But sometimes it's hard to predict. I keep thinking about the business on State Street. One of the most successful businesses there is Drunken Palette,
Yeah.
which is an art studio that allows people to do their own art. And that has been phenomenally successful, but I guarantee that no economic development committee would sit in a room and say, hey, we need a do-it-yourself art shop.
Right.
So it's an interesting balance between having an opportunity where people can start businesses that reflect their passions, that bring people in, and planning, well, we need a coffee shop here, or we need a restaurant, or we need a grocery store or a pharmacy. So
one more quick question.
Okay.
Art, you mentioned that you ran for city council some time back, which I did not know that about you. Have you given any thought to maybe running again? Because we could use some really good people.
I'm kind of busy right now, but I do appreciate I do appreciate your thought there. But no, 2007 was a great experience, and I learned from it, and so here I am with Thames Valley Sustainable Connections. But yeah, there's a place certainly for a lot of policy and political involvement. So. Yeah.
All right, guys,
Yeah.
I'll let you go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, so are we ready with the video? This is a video from a TED Talk in Hawaii by a young woman named Amy Cortez, who has also done a lot of work on
Aloha, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I have to say that's a tough act to follow, that last girl. I'm going to talk to you today about local investing and how it can rebuild the economy one community at a time. But first, I want to ask you to think about a question. What would the world look like if we invested, each and every one of us, 50% of our investment dollars within 50 miles of where we live? Would we have the same high unemployment, or might more people be working if money had been invested locally rather than chasing profit around the globe? Would we have the same urban decay in once vital cities and rural decline across so much of the country? Or might we have thriving main streets and downtowns with diversified economies and healthy tax revenues? And here in Hawaii, where roughly 90% of the food and energy is imported, maybe there would be local companies producing these things so Hawaii could be more self-sufficient. So I first heard that question about investing within 50 miles in the fall of 2009 when I was early into the research on my book. It was posed by Woody Tash, the founder of Slow Money, which is a grassroots organization working to fund local sustainable food and agriculture. Well, 50% might be a pipe dream, but it got me to thinking about the massive imbalance that exists today in our financial system, because the fact is, most of us invest nothing in local companies. Collectively, we have $30 trillion invested in 401ks, mutual funds, and pension funds and the like. Most of that, almost all of that, goes to large publicly traded corporations, often the very same ones that are outsourcing jobs, dodging their taxes, and paying their CEOs ungodly sums while they squeeze their workers. Oops, getting ahead now. So why this imbalance? A large reason is our securities laws, which were put into place in the Great Depression and haven't changed much since. I'm not going to go into detail about them because, believe me, they'll make your head spin. But the bottom line is that today it's easier for most Americans to invest in a company halfway around the world than one in their own backyard. Well, and that's truly a shame because local investing is our best hope to rebuild an economy that's been hollowed out by years of globalization and neglect. Without strong local economies, we can't have a strong national or global economy. So quickly, what do I mean by local? Local companies can be mom and pop shops, they can be startups, they can be companies that employ hundreds of people. The key is that they're locally owned and rooted in their communities. They're stakeholders. And this actually describes most of the nation's 27 million small businesses. And why do these companies matter? Well, small businesses create two out of every 3 jobs and employ half the private workforce. Multinationals, on the other hand, are net job destroyers. They employ a lot of people, but they eliminate many more jobs than they create, at least in this country. And beyond that, local companies add to the character and the identity of our communities. They make them places where we want to live. They promote regional diversity and truly competitive markets rather than monoculture and monopolies. So we should be supporting these companies, not starving them. And that's why it's been so exciting to see this local investment movement building over the last few years, this flowering of citizen finance. And as I was working on my book, I talked to many, many communities across the country that are figuring out how to do that, all within the narrow openings of today's securities laws. And I'm going to share just a few examples with you. My first is about the cops in Clare, Michigan, that saved their town's 111-year-old bakery and revitalized their downtown in the process. Well, one morning, Officer Greg Reinerson, and that's him on the right, was out on patrol when he heard some alarming news. The Clare City Bakery was going to close for good. Well, not only was this bakery a fixture of his youth, but if it closed, it would be yet another shuttered storefront in downtown Clare, which, like many Michigan towns, had been hit hard by the struggling auto industry. So back at the headquarters over lunch, he convinced 8 fellow officers, and that would be the entire Clare police force, to chip in and buy the bakery. Now, these guys are very clever, so the first thing they did was to rename the bakery Cops and Donuts. Because everybody knows how much cops love their donuts, right? And I said they were clever, so they also tweaked the menu, adding the squealer, a maple glazed donut topped with 2 strips of bacon. And they added a line of merchandise, including T-shirts with slogans reading, DWI, donuts were involved. And my absolute favorite, don't glaze me, bro. So the bakery became an overnight success, drawing people from all over. And today, it employs more full-time people than the entire Clare police and fire departments combined. And that success has spilled over to other merchants on their main street. So instead of more vacancies, new stores are opening up. And there's another way that the cops have helped their community. Like many small businesses, they buy as much as they can locally. So their coffee is roasted in town, their T-shirts are printed nearby, and their flour comes from a family-run Michigan supplier. They also support local charities, and they sponsor a t-ball team called the Little Donut Holes. But this is what local companies do. Okay, my next example comes from Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and this is just a 10-minute walk from where I live. It's a great neighborhood, lots of brownstones, really creative people live there, but the one thing they didn't have was a bookstore to call their own. So when two women decided they were going to open a bookstore, people were thrilled. In fact, they were so thrilled that when the women couldn't get a bank loan they needed, about 24 neighbors stepped up and lent them $70,000 in return for a modest interest rate and a discount on books. So 2 years later, the Greenlight Bookstore is thriving and defying all the gloom and doom predictions about independent bookstores. And it's become an integral part of its neighborhood, holding frequent events like this one with the local author Jonathan Lethem. And the best part is that its lenders have become its very best customers. Another example comes from Port Townsend, Washington, about 40 miles north of Seattle. Now, this was once an important shipping center, but more recently, its population and its prospects have dwindled. So, in an effort to reverse that trend, a number of residents began lending money to local businesses. They decided to formalize that relationship, and they created the Local Investing Opportunities Network, or LION for short. Well, to date, LION members have invested almost $1 million in a number of companies, including a bike shop, a real estate project, an organic cidery, and a cheesemaker. And inspired by what the people of Port Townsend have done, other communities now are creating LIONs of their own, such as Madison, Wisconsin, and New York City. And I want to mention that one of the original LION members, James Frazier, has moved to Maui, and he's in the audience today. And finally, I want to share a story about Saranac Lake, New York, a beautiful, picturesque little town in the Adirondacks. Well, several years ago, their only department store went out of business after its parent company took on too much debt and went bankrupt. Well, that left people facing an hour drive each way to get basic items like underwear and sheets that weren't readily available in town. So at first, they tried to attract other retailers into the area, but the only one that was interested was Walmart, which wanted to come in and build a supercenter. Well, many people feared that a supercenter would overwhelm their small village and put their local merchants out of business. So they decided to create their own store. They put together a business plan and started selling shares through what is known as a direct public offering. So that's like an IPO, but without the help or the hefty fees of a Wall Street bank. And because they limited this offering to residents of New York State, they were exempt from federal securities laws. So it took a few years, but they raised more than $500,000, and this past October opened the Saranac Lake Community Store. I like to think of it as the retail equivalent of the Green Bay Packers, a department store that's not going to pick up and leave when a better offer comes along or when its parent company runs into trouble. So these are just a few examples, but I hope they begin to show the power of local investing to revitalize communities. There's one problem with this type of investing, and that is liquidity. How do you get your money out when you need it? And that's where the concept of a local stock exchange comes in. Many people don't realize, but we once had dozens of stock exchanges across the country that fueled the growth of their local economies, from Wheeling, West Virginia, to Boulder, Colorado, to right here in Hawaii. This is a picture of the old Honolulu Stock Exchange, which raised capital for local companies like Bank of Hawaii, Maui Telephone, and Honolulu Rapid Transit. Well, eventually, communications technology made these physical exchanges less important, and trading siphoned off to the New York Stock Exchange. And one by one, they went out of business or they merged. So today, our markets are global and efficient, but they're no longer serving the types of regional growth companies that they once did. So it's against this backdrop that the idea of the local stock exchange is being revived. And there are efforts underway to do that in Pennsylvania, in Tennessee, in California, and right here in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii, as we all know, is blessed with abundant natural resources, yet you import so much of your food and energy. Hawaii is also rich in financial capital, but much of that is invested on the mainland. So a Hawaii stock exchange would help keep more of that capital local, so it could be used to fund companies that can help Hawaii lessen its dependence on imports. Companies like Pacific Biodiesel and the Haile Maile Pineapple Company. And there are also some people working on the Hawaii Stock Exchange here today, including David Fisher from Maui Ventures. And they face a lot of challenges in trying to get something like this done, not the least of which is regulatory. But there's some really good news here to report. This may soon, all of this, local stock exchanges, local investing, may soon become much easier. There's legislation making its way through Congress that would loosen some of these restrictions that prevent us all from investing in our local companies. The Entrepreneur Access to Capital Act passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. There are similar bills in the Senate, and some people expect a bill like this to pass as early as this spring. And that would be great. That would open up huge opportunities for local investing and bring it into the mainstream. So someday, instead of putting your money in the S&P 500, maybe you could put it in the Maui 50. So I started off by asking you to think about that question of what would it be like if we all invested 50% of our money within 50 miles of where we live? Well, I mean, let's face it, we'll probably never get to 50%, but what about 10% or 5% or even 1%? 1% of that $30 trillion that Americans have in long-term investments is $300 billion. To put that in perspective, that's roughly half of all of the small business bank loans outstanding today. Imagine the transformative impact of $300 billion on the Main Street economy, on companies like Cops and Donuts and Greenlight Bookstore and Pacific Biodiesel. These are the companies that create jobs and healthy communities. These are the companies that we should be investing in. And this is the way we can rebuild the economy from the ground up, one community at a time. Mahalo.
Thanks a lot. That went off without a hitch.
Yeah.
I'm here with Art Costa, and one community at a time. That can be New London.
Right.
So what are the potentials in New London that you see about building out our economy from the ground up or from the inside out?
I think we have incredible opportunities. As I say, we did an economic leakage study here using a calculator just for our zip code, and I think it was well over $1 billion is just escapes the area, and on the other side of that, there's over $1 billion, believe it or not, here in New London, locked up in pension plans and savings and so forth that are completely outside of New London in terms of investment locally. So that's an identification of where the money is. It's easy to take those 401ks and so forth because that's where everything just is set up to go. And that means that that kind of money just leaves the area. But it's not just money, it's also human capital, it's natural capital. So we have tremendous assets, as we all know. And so capturing that wealth in whatever form it comes into, building from the inside out, recognizing the strengths that we have, and not simply looking at what we need. It's amazing what we have may cover most of what we need, but frequently there's a tendency to look outside to see what we can
now
bring
you've
in.
given the example before of commercial kitchens.
Yeah.
That a lot of organizations or small groups think, oh, we need a licensed kitchen to do something, to make salads to sell at a farmer's market or whatever. And what's the story on licensed kitchens in New London?
Well, that's the thing, is we have many commercial kitchens. Every church has got one, the schools have got them, the senior center has them, certainly restaurants, but most of these commercial kitchens are underutilized. And so taking account of those, taking an inventory, is part of understanding what assets we have. So before we say, well, we need another $100,000 or $50,000 or whatever dollar grant to buy another commercial kitchen, at least let's see what we have and what we could do to make those better utilized. And I think of a particular bakery in New London who, when they started out, went to Alliance for Living, who has a commercial kitchen. And when they started their business, they went there to do all their baking. Later on, they bought their own or they got their own kitchen. I don't think they did it through a grant. They managed to get the capital to make that happen. But utilizing those things that already are in place, it's amazing what assets we have. And once you build there, then you know better what you really need, and can then appropriately target, funding from wherever to begin to, make those things happen.
I like the idea of thinking about, using what assets we have more densely or, more intensively, and, commercial kitchens, but also parking. You see some lots that could be used by churches on Sunday, by offices during the day, and by, arts galleries and retail in the afternoon and evening. And we have some parking like that, but we have a lot that's very isolated, that's empty for 2/3 of the day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, we have a lot of acreage. If we really want to assess the acreage we've allocated to parking, and yet we never seem to have enough of it. But yeah, when we started to work with landmarks on what I refer to as Northeast New London or East New London, and Hodges Square area, we recruited a couple of interns from the high school. They were seniors. And they worked with us to do some on-the-ground asset assessment. What are the streets? What are the conditions? And what parks are available? What kind of basketball courts do we have? And just took an accounting of all of the things we have, and it's amazing what the assets we have. And it's a question of mobilizing those. It's kind of like capital. If we have all this money flowing through, how do we kind of keep as much as we can locally, and make it work for us instead of just escaping and thinking we have nothing.
And the common belief is that other than the two campuses way up at the north end of town, that's a poor neighborhood, but it really isn't that poor a neighborhood.
No, it isn't. I mean, again, $62 million. And what folks identified is that there's a substantial number of dollars for food and for travel. Most of that's commuting. So a large portion of that $62 million is dedicated to those two areas. That's an opportunity. What could we do in terms of at least reducing the cost of travel? Food is a wonderful economic opportunity, sure. Both in growing it, but also in processing it prior to it actually ending up on your plate. There are all kinds of things. You mentioned the commercial right. kitchen. That could be right. part of a food zone, if you will, in a particular section of New London. That could become an economic, just a wonderful boom for that area, for the city as a whole.
Well, yeah, for the well-being of the city, because if I recall, we rate very poorly in food security in the city.
Right.
So it could be a source of economic growth, but also could provide us with a lot more security that food will be available and high-quality food will be available.
And that's a really important thing along with water. But food security is very fragile. We depend greatly on the import of food from places very, very far away from New London. And so if we've seen, storms come through, and I know, since we have the farmers market, what that does to farmers. And if we depended upon a local food system yeah. the way it is, we'd have a pretty difficult time. So it's really incumbent upon us to create a secure food environment, which means a lot of different things, but and there's a great economic benefit to that as well.
And I guess we can mention now that there is going to be a third farmers market in town this summer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're having our third New London Field of Greens market up in, we just refer to it as the Hodges Square near Mr. G's or Upper William Street. And that'll start June 22nd, so that's exciting, and we've got a number of vendors that'll be there, and the community really is involved in this. So I see this as a community market. Field of Greens will operate it, but with great support from the community in every aspect. So it's pretty exciting.
Well, now that we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left, let's talk about the opportunity that people will have to see and hear Michael Schumann later this month.
Yes, I can't speak with enough praise in terms of what Mr. Schumann brings to this area. And it's one thing to bring him here, but what we really need to make sure is that we have people in the room to both listen and to interact with him. He's a wonderful speaker. He's a very gracious speaker. And he's a friendly guy, so he's a very approachable person. He's written a number of books. He's an economist, and he's an entrepreneur, and he's also a lawyer, but his law focus is on laws governing local investment, so he can speak to what can be done, what probably can be done in the near future, if not now, in terms of how we can create mechanisms for people who want to invest locally. There are businesses that want to expand. Capital is their biggest problem. In fact, when they did a survey of businesses throughout the country, small businesses, they found that it's not taxes that these businesses are most concerned about, it's capital. They need money to expand their business, to start up new product lines or whatever. And that has just become ever so much more difficult for small businesses to get. And so by us all being able to invest in our local economy, having the means to do that, we can begin to help turn the corner on that. Again, if at least half of our jobs are created by small businesses, $30 trillion is what's out in the global financial marketplace. if we could get 15 trillion of that to
would
all the
be
small businesses
amazing.
throughout the country, just imagine what things would be like. But even if we could get a small percentage, as Amy in that video mentions, even a 1%, it would be a tremendous diversion of capital into the engines of economics that we really need to see happen here locally. But we can begin to do
Yeah.
some of that ourselves without expecting it to happen.
Now, Michael Schumann will be here for 2 separate events, right? So
Yes.
maybe we can talk first about Thursday night, May 30th.
Sure. Thursday night, May 30th, Mr. Schumann will be here at Stonefleet Tavern. New London Local First has its annual dinner, and that will be on the 30th. That's a Thursday, 5:30, and then it just goes through dinner. Dinner will begin at about 6 o'clock, and so he'll be our keynote speaker, and there'll be questions and so forth. So that's that event, and that's open to folks who are interested. We obviously get word out to New London Local First businesses so that they kind of have a
Yeah, they have first dibs.
first dibs at it.
Because the capacity is limited to about
Yeah.
50 or 60 people, right?
Yeah, right. So there's only so much room. The next day, we're going to have a full-day workshop at Harbor Towers, and Bean and Leaf is going to supply the breakfast and lunch, and they're down on the first level.
Right, so
it's a
they're just,
perfect.
50 feet away.
Right, they can just bring it up the elevator, and so we're excited about that. Again, there is a limitation in terms of how many people, but we figure again between 50, 60 people. And it's really a great opportunity. We'll be filming this as well, but the interactiveness is going to really make this an important event. And I think that Mr. Schumann will provide some great ideas. He's a guy of a wealth of information and how-tos. A very practical man. He's not going to just
So it will be almost a roadmap for us and not just talking about ideas.
a lot of what you can do, takeaways that people can start kind of working around.
So if people want to register, since we're down to our last minute and a half, they can go to the Thames Valley Sustainable Connections website.
That's correct.
Now, is there registration for both events there, or
Well,
not
it's
yet?
just the workshop right now, and we'll get the other one out. But the workshop is there. In fact, if you just go to the website, it's right there on the home page. So we've put more information about Michael Schumann there, and as I say, his books, I think, and links and so forth are all in there as well. So he's kind of the person that provides the most in terms of economic how-to. So I think it'll be good to check out the website, read a little bit more about him, and hopefully, if you can make it that day, register. And
It sounds like a great event.
Yeah.
And our city might be ready for it.
I hope so. I know we've got some folks from the city that plan to attend, and we'd like to see as many people who are interested there as possible.
Okay, so we have our last 30 seconds. Thank you, Art. Go to the Thames Valley Sustainable Connections website, which is thamesvalleysustainableconnections.org. And you can register and get more information. Next week, our guest will be Luther Weeks from Connecticut Voters Count, and he will be talking about some legislation that's being considered in Connecticut that's related to voting and elections. So I'll see you then, and maybe I'll see you also on May 30th and 31st.
Great.
Thanks, Art,
Thank you.
and we'll see you next week.
Dance with me, Rosalita. You know when I loved you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. You know if you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. conjure. Breezes blowing through my long red hair. You know it's not so far to wander back to that easy life we led back there. Dance with me, Rosalita. You know when I love you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. You know if you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. Dance with me, Rosalita. You know when I loved you, we were still so innocent. Sing with me, Rosalita. You know if you wanted, we could bring it all back tonight. But sometimes I still wonder